Podcaster Society General Questions and Answers for August 15th, 2018. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. It is good to be talking to you again through a live webinar, and we're going to be doing more of these. Some of them will be topical, like in about 2 weeks or a week and a half or so, we have a live Q&A with our expert Chris Curran talking about podcast engineering, and there will be more specific webinars coming up about certain topics like legal issues, community issues, monetization, and more. So some of these questions that I'll be addressing will be addressed in further detail probably later in some of these other webinars, but I want to make sure to address some of these now. The best way to submit your questions for webinars is to post in the forums. You could put your question as a single sentence as the title of your forum post, and then you can add more details in the body of that forum post, like if you have stats or more details or pictures or anything like that that you want to suggest, or images or files that you need to upload, like audio samples or something like that that you want us to check out to help us better serve you in Podcaster Society so that you can make your podcast amazing. I want to dig back a little bit into some older forum posts to start with and then get more current with some of the latest stuff. Chris Lewis from Dad Spotlight podcast asked about smart speaker briefings. First of all, he wants to know how many other Podcaster Society members are doing anything like a smart speaker briefing for Alexa or other smart speakers, and what you've found works thus far. And he says, I've heard Dave Jackson talking a bit about these briefings, but I am interested in learning more about the setup and how they work. So what first is a smart speaker briefing? Just so we're all on the same page. This is mostly popularized by the Amazon smart speaker devices, like the little hockey puck ones or taller ones, or maybe you have the skills built into some other kind of smart speaker that you're working with. This is where you can use it in different ways, and maybe you don't even realize this if you have one of these kinds of devices. But you could say things like, you could say, hey lady in the tube, good morning, or something like that. And then she can initiate a series of events. And one of those events that can be programmed into your morning sequence is a daily briefing of some sort. You can also listen to briefings individually and subscribe to them kind of like a podcast, but they're not officially necessarily a podcast. Now, you can release them as a podcast as well. So what can you do with these things? Think of this as short, valuable content that someone can take with them in some way, and that's metaphorically take with them. So this could be like daily news. For example, podnews.net is a daily podcast news email newsletter. I highly recommend it. It's by James Cridland. And in each episode of the Pod News podcast, he reads just a short blurb about the latest podcasting news, as well as his daily email newsletter includes short blurbs about the latest podcasting news. That's a perfect example of something that could be done as a smart speaker briefing. It's very short. His episodes are about 90 seconds long, and he does a really good job. He is a journalist, so he knows how to share the core information, just the facts, ma'am, about a particular story. And he points you to the website as well as the newsletter where you can get those links. You could do something similar with your podcast. Maybe. That really depends on the kind of podcast you host and the kind of content that you put out. Think of this not as a way of distributing your normal podcast, but think of it as, is there a way that you can convey information relevant to your podcast or your audience in a very short form, potentially on a daily basis? Now, maybe you could even do weekly, but think about what could you do daily. If you have a comedy podcast, maybe it's a joke a day. If you do anything current events related, then it could be the news of the day or something that's coming up, some kind of announcement. It could be the latest scores from sports or stock reports or anything like that. It could be a tip a day. These kinds of things can work really well in super short briefings. Now, how much will people actually consume it? Yeah, I don't know, because I don't really see smart speaker briefings as an opportunity to grow your audience, because there is, I kind of hate using this term, but there is a discovery problem with all of these smart speaker skills. there is so much that your smart speaker can do, and so many people don't use it to do those kinds of things. Even those people who use daily briefings might not know there are daily briefings available on certain topics they might be interested in, just like people don't realize that there are podcasts about topics they might be interested in. So there is a little bit of a discovery problem, a little bit of an issue of just awareness of what the smart speakers can do. But you could look at this as a way to further engage with your audience and provide them with more value if there's that kind of thing that you could release, some kind of super short form daily or weekly or so update, a daily tip or something, whatever works for you. And you can advertise that then on your podcast, on your website, through your social accounts, through everywhere that your audience is already connected with you. And this could probably primarily be an additional point of connection with your audience. It probably won't help you grow your audience, but there is that chance that the way that smart speaker briefings are discovered could change. Maybe your show is featured. So always prepare for success. Don't assume that you know everything about your audience. And the big way that you can prepare for success is make sure, even if you know for a fact that everyone listening to that smart speaker briefing has come to it from your podcast, never assume that, even if you know it. Point people back to your website, maybe even mention your podcast. Just don't get too crazy on the calls to action. Some of us might make calls to action that are as long as a smart speaker daily briefing. Make it really simple. You could say something like, if you have daily tips, like for example with Chris Lewis, where he's talking to dads and spotlighting dads and having conversations that fathers would be interested in and such. So maybe he has the daily dad tip, or maybe it's the daily dad joke or something like that. So he could say, for more conversations for fathers, go to dadspotlight.com. Or for more inspiration to help you be a better dad, go to dadspotlight.com. You could do that with sports podcasts as well. For more conversations about this great sports team, go to my favorite sports team podcast.com, whatever your site is. So point people back to your site. Don't give them all of those calls to action of follow us on Twitter, email us this, go here, go there, do this, do that. Just point them back to your website as a place where they can get more information. Maybe it's even more information about whatever it is that you shared in the smart speaker briefing. So it could be, if you do an interview podcast, it could be tips that came from the interview. Maybe for every one episode of your podcast, which is weekly, you can pull 5 tips out of that. And each one of those tips could be a different day of the week. And then in that tip at the end, you could say, to hear more about this tip and my full conversation with the expert behind it, go to myawesomepodcast.com. So always point back to that property that you own. Now, how can you actually make a smart speaker briefing? There are different ways of doing that. So the easiest thing to do is just look at the documentation. You can search Google for how to make a smart speaker briefing, or how to make an Alexa briefing or a Google Home briefing or anything like that. Google Home doesn't really have the same kind of briefing setup as the Amazon devices do, but I wouldn't be surprised if those kinds of things are more cross-platform friendly at some point. Plus, even though you already have a podcast, I do recommend you consider releasing those briefings as a podcast, because some people may prefer to listen to it as a podcast and they may want that super short content, like the podnews.net email briefing, for example, and as well as the short audio briefing. I don't know if it's even available as a smart speaker briefing. I assume it is. It would be perfect for one. But would I listen to it that way? Actually, no, I wouldn't. But that's just because for me, I am so connected to podcasts that I prefer to listen through podcasts and through a podcast app. So even if there was a smart speaker briefing for Pod News, I probably wouldn't use it, but other people might. Other people who have smart speakers as a tighter part of their daily routine would probably love to have some kind of briefing built into their daily routine. And maybe you could even educate your audience a little bit about that. So you can look at this as that opportunity to better connect with your audience, maybe give them smaller chunks of content more frequently, or in a way that's just a little bit easier for them to digest. And then how to do it, or what results rather, that you could see from that. honestly, I don't know. I don't know how to measure that just yet, but I'm sure that there are ways that you could measure that. And if you try it, definitely please share your own results. Now, in this webinar and all future Q&A webinars as well, what we'll be doing with the questions is the questions will be listed in the notes that go along with the webinar, and you can subscribe to the webinar via a podcast as well in your favorite podcast apps. Just use your username and password when you need to authenticate with that. And you can then see the notes, the questions, and the questions will link to the forum posts. And this is why I want you to post your questions in the forums, is so that we can keep the conversation going from here. So when you go to the show notes for a particular webinar, click on that link for the forum discussions, and then add your own input. If you try something and you want to come back and share your results, or if you have your own opinion on something, your own experience to add, your own thoughts. If there are extra details you want to add or suggestions you want to give, don't feel like only the experts can answer questions. You can answer questions too, provide your input, ask questions, dig deeper and such. So you'll be able to do that in the forums, and the links will be inside of the notes that go along with this webinar, and also through the website if you just want to watch the webinar replay through the website. So thank you, Chris Lewis, for that question. Next question came from Jeffrey Warren, and I see Mark also asked a question in the chat we'll get to in a little bit. Jeffrey Warren asked how to monetize with a smaller audience. He said, I wanted to ask about monetizing with a, quote, smaller, unquote, audience. A little backstory. For the past 8 months, I was represented by a specific podcast advertising company. They were really good to work with. I was unfortunately just notified that due to my download numbers, they weren't going to be representing me anymore. Another podcasting agency said I'd need about 5,000 downloads per episode for them to represent me. I usually get anywhere from 7,500 to 8,500 downloads per month, and that number increases to about 12,000 to 13,000 or so per month during the NFL season. Jeffrey's podcast, by the way, is the Philadelphia Sports Table. Perhaps I'm being naive, but I think there's a value in these numbers, but even more with our listeners. I feel as though my small audience is being shut out, and consequently, we're being shut out from receiving advertising revenue. Where should we go from here? Or is it just building up the audience numbers from here? Thanks so much. I'm really glad the webinars have started again. I asked Jeffrey some more questions too about this. Directly, I asked him some things. First, I wanted to find out what agency was he working with, and the agency he was working with is a good agency. And I also asked him some questions about his download numbers that I can share with you some of this. So the downloads per month versus downloads per episode. I've talked about this before. I've done blog posts and such about it and podcast episodes over at the Audacity podcast. Downloads per month is kind of a meaningless number. Well, it is a meaningless number, not kind of, it is, because it doesn't actually tell you the size of your audience. To illustrate, let's say you have 100 people downloading each episode, but you release one episode per day. So in a month, that's 3,000 downloads in a month. Is that 3,000 people? No, that's 100 people downloading 30 episodes in a month. But the math doesn't even work out that directly. You can't just divide it by how many episodes you release in a month, because many times people will go back and listen to older episodes, either automatically with their podcast app or manually they'll decide to go back and listen to old episodes, especially if they really like your podcast and you provide valuable, timeless information. So I'm experimenting with some numbers, and you're welcome to play with these as well. A basic formula that would be your monthly downloads divided by, I'm not sure how to describe this formula, but monthly downloads divided by, and then you put this formula in parentheses. It would be the number of episodes you release per month times 1.5, so 50% more. So, for example, Jeffrey does, I believe, 2 episodes per week. So I would say monthly downloads, or you take 8 times 1.5, you end up with 12, and then monthly downloads divided by 12. So if he's getting, let's assume 8,000 downloads per month, monthly downloads divided by 12 works out to be 666, mark of the beast number. And that's pretty close to what he said he's getting in downloads per episode. So that formula may work. Go ahead and try it with your own numbers to see if it works. You take number of episodes per month times 1.5 and then divide how many downloads in a month you received by that number. And it might not work at all. And that just shows that downloads per month, really meaningless metric as far as audience size. Where it can be a helpful metric is in audience engagement, especially when you see those numbers go up and you're not increasing your podcast publishing schedule. You're still publishing once a week, twice a week, once a day, whatever your schedule is. Because that shows you that something about that particular month is more popular. Then you can dig into individual episodes and compare how one episode did against other episodes. So the point is, Jeffrey's audience is not 8,000. It's closer to 500, 600, more for particular episodes. And it's, of course, higher during this NFL season, lower during the off season. So this, quote, small audience, unquote, still is valuable to you, the podcaster. But it's not valuable to an advertiser, or maybe not most advertisers that people would think of. And the kind of advertisers that you might work with through advertising agencies like True Native Media or Megaphone or Midroll or Podcast One or Blueberry or Libsyn or anyone like that. Advertising as a form of monetization for your podcast, I think really only works if you either have a very large audience, and I would really say 10,000 downloads or more is when it really starts making sense to have an advertiser. 5,000 downloads or more is often the bottom line metric, but some companies, like I think Midroll now requires 20,000 downloads or more per episode to work with them for advertising. And that number goes up on some of these larger networks because as they get more professional in how they negotiate these things and hire people to work on these things, they need to make their ends meet too. So that's why they have to make sure that they're making hundreds or thousands of dollars on the deal too with their cut. And cut is even something else to consider when you're working with advertisers, but I'll get more to that in a minute. The other thing is, so you have to have either a really big audience or you have to have a very valuable sponsor. And that value could be in how much money they stand to make by advertising on your show. So if someone advertises on your show and they stand to make $1,000 from one sale, then they're going to probably pay a lot more, especially if you have their ideal audience. Always look for relevancy in whatever kind of monetization method you're trying to make. So either big downloads, 5,000 downloads per episode is a typical minimum threshold. 20,000, I don't know for sure if that's Midroll's limit, but I think it's somewhere around there. I've heard that a particular other network, I think, even requires 50,000 or more. But us mere mortals aren't anywhere close to that, and that's okay. You can monetize your podcast with a smaller audience. The thing I want to challenge you to do is, while your audience is, quote, smaller, and just whenever you hear that word small, put quotations around it, quotation marks, because it's not really about the size of the audience. It's about how engaged they are and how much relevance there is for whatever you could sell them. And here's the big secret to selling anything, whether it's advertising in your podcast or a product or service or anything like that. Sell what people want. As ridiculously profound as that seems, I feel like sometimes we forget that. Like, if I took a sponsor on the Audacity podcast, which my policy now is basically I don't take sponsors There have been companies who have been hounding me for months saying, we want to sponsor an episode. We want to sponsor an episode. And I've said, no, sorry. It's not worth it to me to receive a sponsor because of the size, the relevance and such. But if I were to take an advertiser on the Audacity podcast that was, well, let's pick on one of the popular advertisers, Casper Mattresses. Every podcaster sleeps, or almost everyone, except John Lee Dumas. But what relevance does a mattress have to what I'm talking about in my podcast? Nothing. Yes, it's relevant to the person, but it's not relevant to me, relevant to the content I'm discussing. So it's going to seem quite disconnected. When I did a TV show fan podcast about Once Upon a Time, which is finally off the air, the show is, and so the podcast is over too. But there are very few commercials I remember. I remember being annoyed at how many car commercials, pharmaceuticals, cell phones, and insurance commercials there were. And it seemed like all of the commercials were about those four things. The commercials that stood out were the ones that were either really funny, like Arby's commercials often were very funny. You know, bacon is a gift that pigs give you when you're good. And what also really, really stood out, a commercial I saw once, but it stood out because it made itself completely relevant to the content that I was watching. And that was a commercial for the upcoming movie, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. And the way that they started the commercial out. So Once Upon a Time was a TV show about fairy tales. And the way they started out their commercial was they said, once upon a time, those are the words that start some of the greatest stories we've grown up with. Right there, I was hooked. They had me. They spoke those magic words, once upon a time, because that was the TV show I was watching. And they also talked about fairy tales and stories and then connected it back to Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, the movie that was coming out at that point. That stuck with me because it was 100% relevant to the content that I was there for. And so the ad was relevant. The ad was memorable. And yes, that was a fun movie. And it was relevant. People who like Once Upon a Time would probably like that movie too. So that was something I wanted. I didn't want insurance. I didn't want cell phone plans. I didn't want pharmaceuticals. But more entertainment relevant to what I was getting, yes, I wanted that. So bringing this back to your podcast, don't only think about advertisers or even relevant advertisers. Now, it's great if you find relevant advertisers. Don't look for the Caspers, the Audibles, the meal kit things and all of that. Find a sponsor that's relevant to your podcast. And unfortunately, if you have smaller download numbers, you might not be able to get the help of an advertising agency to find these sponsors for you or negotiate for you. At some point, we will have some templates you'll be able to use yourself so that you could just fill in a form to say this is the name, or you could copy it yourself or download a text expander snippet or something like that. So you could just fill in a couple specific details and send it off on your own to try and negotiate things with your sponsor. So we'll make a sponsorship kit for you that you'll be able to use in that way, and if you want to approach a sponsor. When you're working with advertising, make sure it's something relevant to your audience, to the content that you're talking about. But step back from this. This is really what I want to challenge you to think, because even if you're working with a 100% relevant sponsor, it might not be worth it to them, or it might not be worth it to you. When we're talking about standard cost per 1,000 downloads measured by CPM, cost per mille, or cost per 1,000, typical rates might be somewhere around $20, $25. So if you have a podcast that gets 600 downloads per episode, and that is that works out to be, if we have a $25 CPM, so $25 per 1,000 downloads, that's $15 per episode if you're getting 600 downloads per episode. And then if you're doing 8 episodes per month, that's only $120. Now I say only, again, quotation marks could be around that. maybe $120 to you is fantastic and you would love it. And you'd be super happy if that's all you got was $120. Maybe you wouldn't be. But that is a pretty small number. And that might cover your bills for podcasting, but might not help you accomplish other things. That's up to you. Instead, I want you to think outside of the advertising idea. Even at higher CPMs, like $45 CPMs. And some podcasts that have extremely relevant, engaged audiences for the advertiser can ask for a higher CPM, like $45, or different ways that you can have sponsored content. Maybe it's not just an ad spot in your podcast, but they sponsor a whole section and they get tons of mentions in that section, or you talk about their product, review their product. These are different ways that you can have sponsored content that can pay a lot more than a mere CPM rate. So look for relationships. And I like that Mark DeCote is pointing out in the chat room. He said, do the Glenn the Geek method and look at magazines in your niche and contact the people who are advertising in the quote classifieds unquote ad in the back. They're looking to talk to your audience and are willing to pay more than a CPM to reach them. And that's true. Potential advertisers there. And if you can deal with them directly, that might be even better because then they get to know you and you can convince them about the value of your audience. But speaking of value of your audience, let's do some more math here. And by the way, this webinar will go as long as it needs to answer all of these questions. So if you have a hard out, you can catch the replay later. Let's say that same $25 CPM, $25 per 1,000 downloads. What does that make each person worth? It's a weird way to put it. It seems so heartless to put it that way, but I want you to think about this because you might be surprised by this, but $25 CPM makes each download of your podcast worth 2.5 cents. Now, that doesn't mean each person is worth 2.5 cents because in a year, let's just say you do one episode per week. So in a year, that is, as I do math live, in a year, that would be $1.30. So each person with a $25 CPM, assuming you publish weekly, each person, each audience member is worth $1.30 per year. Now, yes, that sounds heartless to say that. And you're probably thinking, oh, people are worth so much more than that. Yes, exactly. That's the point. And I'm not saying like squeeze them for everything they're worth. Not at all like that. But I do want you to recognize how podcast advertising kind of undervalues your audience. And it is really putting a price tag on your audience to say each person is worth 2.5 cents per download, per episode that they download. But you can do better than that and serve your audience better as well. So what are some of those ways that you can monetize with a quote small unquote audience? Going back to something I said earlier, sell what your audience wants. So you need to find out, what do they want? What are their problems? If your podcast is a kind of educational podcast, then you're solving some kind of problem. If your podcast is an entertainment-based podcast, then you're not necessarily solving a problem. I mean, there is that, we could talk about the psychological needs for entertainment and such, but basically you're providing something they want, not a need. You're providing them with a desire. You're filling that in some way. You're feeding them their dessert compartment in some way. So what can you do that also can fit in there? So think about, put yourself in your audience's place. You're a fan of whatever that thing is. Like for Jeffrey, Jeff, he is talking about sports, Philadelphia sports specifically. So what do Philly sports fans like? They like the sports teams, probably. They like Philadelphia, probably. what kinds of things do you think they would want? Well, since they're fans of something, fans of things often like to represent their fandom in different ways. That could be with swag of some sort, like t-shirts, hats, mugs, stickers, posters, other things maybe that are more unique to, or that are unique to that field. Like in podcasting, for example, a poster is not necessarily as valuable as maybe a little microphone keychain or something that you put your microphone on. Think like that. Don't just think generic swag. Think specific swag. So for sports fans, it could be, for example, a seat cushion that they can take with them to the stadium. It could be binoculars that help them see the game better if they're watching a game live. It could be something that they wear that helps them connect and represent their favorite sports teams, or conversation starters, or something like that. Now, whenever you're talking about fan content, you have to be very careful with trademarks. Don't take the logo, don't take slogans or anything like that from the sports team. Nothing official. But look back at your podcast and the feedback you've received from your audience. Maybe look at your podcast reviews. Remember, if you've been a member for at least a month of Podcaster Society, you can get access to my podcast reviews for free. Just reach out to me if I've not set you up with that yet. And look for things that your audience has connected with in some way that they've enjoyed. Let me use Rhett and Link from YouTube as an example. They've said some crazy things in the past. And one thing in particular I remember that just came out in the course of their episode is, I think it was Link, who is the guy who wears the glasses. He said, "Let the tigers tiger." And just a silly little saying, but that was the top pick from their audience for when they were making t-shirts. So they got this little, like, it looks like a logo, a circular logo that has a tiger in the middle, and around it says, "Let the tigers tiger." And that's something that resonates with their audience. And they're like, "Oh yeah, that's hilarious. I loved that." They want to represent. So it could be something in your podcast too. It could be some joke that you guys have made up. It could be some saying, something that is not trademarked or copyrighted by anyone else. Please make sure you don't use anything owned or created by anyone else without their license from them. Gordon Firemark can talk more about the legal issues. But if it's something you've created, then that can work great. So look at things you've said in the podcast, jokes you've made, things your audience have said. If it's stuff from your audience, you might need to ask their permission, unless like maybe you had some form already that said whatever feedback you send us for the podcast, you're granting us license to use however we want for the podcast. Maybe you're covered there. Again, legal issues, I would defer to our expert, Gordon Firemark. So you can find those ways that they can represent and connect with the podcast, or connect with the thing that you do a podcast about in some way. If you can't create that stuff yourself, or slap a logo on something through like TeePublic or Redbubble or Amazon or something like that, maybe you can find products that already have stuff like that, and you can become affiliates for those things. Like for the Audacity to podcast, it pays my mortgage from Amazon.com affiliate income alone. And that's from years and years of mentioning products in relevant context, not like taking a commercial break, but I'm talking about a microphone. And I say, if you like this microphone too, I've got the link for you to purchase it from Amazon, my affiliate link in the show notes. People buy from that. It takes a while to build that up. I remember when I earned my first 12 cents, I think it was. I was so excited. Many years ago, different podcast even. That can take a while to build up, but it can be residual. With a podcast advertiser, typically there's a cutoff, and that might be after a month or maybe 60 days that they'll stop counting, they'll cut you the check and pay you then. Now you can use certain other services, like Megaphone is one, and there are some others that do dynamic ad insertion. Dynamic ad insertion is where you mark that this is a particular place where an ad can be placed, and they can stitch that into all of your back catalog episodes. So that's when your downloads per month is a little bit more relevant, because that does mean 8,000 people could hear that same ad this month, whereas next month, I'm sorry, not 8,000 people. there are 8,000 impressions for that ad this month in all of the episodes. And the next month, it could be a different ad, something like that. That's dynamic ad insertion. Programmatic ad insertion is built on top of dynamic, but programmatic is where the ads are inserted automatically without your consent. It's kind of like, think of Google display ads. That's programmatic advertising, where it's just automatically bid and it's based on relevancy sometimes, not all the time, and you often don't have control over it. I'm not a fan of programmatic, but you can do dynamic well, especially if you, the host, can record the ads and have them stitched automatically in. Megaphone can do that. Libsyn Pro can do that. I think Blueberry will soon be able to do that as well. There's some different services that can do that kind of thing for you. And you can just say, this is the ad spot in this episode, this one, and such. But again, that's looking at the advertising. Also look at things that besides physical products, if there's any kind of digital product that you can create. And a digital product could be a membership of some sort. It could be like a club. It could be some kind of bonus that they get from you. Like maybe you have a bonus commentary on a movie and you only sell that commentary and you tell people this is a way that we help raise money for the podcast. Like one of the podcasts on my network, Welcome to Level 7, is a podcast about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It started as primarily a podcast about the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show, and it's branched out as the MCU has also branched out. But they have this episode about the movie Howard the Duck. Horrible Marvel movie. But they do this episode, commentary about it, and they only sell that episode. You could do something like that too. If you have a TV show fan podcast, you could consider having the unofficial complete season commentary, where after you've watched the entire season or maybe watched the entire show, you go back and record your live commentary, just like they do on the discs. You could record your own commentary and you tell people, okay, when we say this is when you press play on your DVD or whatever to watch it along with us. Make sure you're not copying the copyrighted audio into your audio, but you just have your audio track layered over it. Riff Tracks kind of does that same thing where they make fun of the movie. And you know, for a sports thing, that could be something that you could do too, where you could say, hey, we want to make fun of one game per month. So if you subscribe to this special thing that we offer, then you can listen to our unexpert commentary on the game. And what you do is you're basically cracking jokes the whole time based on what's happening in the game. That kind of stuff is extra value. It's value people can't get anywhere else. And it's value people will pay for when they see the value in it. You could also look at providing other kind of value through simply crowdfunding, like Patreon or Patreon-like services, where if people donate to your podcast directly, then they get some kind of benefit back. That benefit could be merely recognition. The benefit could be they get a message read in your podcast. That benefit could be they get a shout out to their own project or a badge on your website, or they get a special title, or maybe they get some physical swag. And it doesn't have to be something fancy. It could be stickers. It could be a coaster. It could be some other kind of swag. They could also get other benefits like a bonus episode per month, or maybe what you edited out of your podcast. That's something that we enjoyed doing with our Once Upon a Time podcast, is that we said everyone who donates to the podcast gets access to our bloopers. So we were actually making money from our mistakes, because our mistakes would often be hilarious. And when we knew that people would be listening to our mistakes, we were more okay with messing up and having fun with it as well. And it just generally lifted the mood of the podcast, because it wasn't like, oh man, I said that incorrectly. Let me do that again. But sometimes we could have fun with it. Or I remember a time that someone that donated and wanted a shout out for their podcast was Ugly Ducklings. And I just could not say Ugly Ducklings. I kept saying Ugly Ducklings. And that ended up being a hilarious blooper, and some other things that we just ran with, had some fun with for a little bit. Okay, brought it back on topic. Then we edit that out. But then what we edited out, we stick into another file and it's bloopers for that episode. And our audience loved that. We'd just do a little bit of tighter editing so it would sound funnier, sometimes put some music behind that. And our audience loved that. Don't underestimate the value that your audience sees in you. They might be eager to give $1 per month, $5 per month, something like that. Now, even if they're only giving $1 per month, go back to that number that I mentioned. A $25 CPM works out to be 2.5 cents per download. In a month of one episode per week, you're up to 10 cents per person. But if that person is donating $1, they're more engaged. You're making more money from that. And it's a better option that might work with your podcast. So you can monetize with a smaller audience. Now, you're not going to necessarily make your living from a small audience, but there are plenty of options to you. Think of it this way. If you cut advertising out of the picture, what else could you do? Many podcasters just default to think advertising, sponsors and such. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it's wrong to start with that assumption that that's the only way to monetize or the best way to monetize. There are other ways to monetize. Affiliates, making your own products. It could be bonuses that you sell to your audience in some way, or just get your audience to be part of the club. You could say, this is the Philly Club or the Philly Cheese Club for the Philadelphia Sports Table, or it's the Sports Table Club or something like that. So I hope that's helped. We'll have more discussion in the future. I want to do a whole webinar just on monetization stuff. So we'll probably get into this even more then, and we'll announce that when that's coming. I want to jump to the live chat room to answer a question there. Mark DeCote asked about Messy.fm. He said, I just heard about it. Is it similar to Anchor? Is it as bad? Well, Anchor is pretty bad. Actually, I just started typing Anchor. Messy.fm, at first I wondered, is this just a parody of Anchor? But Messy.fm is looking to be another podcast media host, as well as provide some basic tools for you, some analytics, some editing and features, and they say that it's free. Now, I've not actually had experience with this. They say it's time to share your voice. We make it easier to become a podcaster. Base level is 100% free. Create show art, record, edit, add music, publish your show, get analytics. Here's the thing. If you've already started your podcast, Anchor, Messy.fm, services like that, probably not for you, because most likely you've matured beyond what these tools were designed to do. Now, some tools might do something a little bit easier. Anchor is not the first tool. By long shot, they're not the first tool to allow you to podcast straight from your phone. A much better, more developed tool, I think, that also gives you a lot more control and ownership would be Spreaker. You can do a lot more with the Spreaker app to podcast directly from your phone, publish to a Spreaker RSS feed, which gives you control and ownership, and you can redirect that whenever you want. All that stuff that you hear a lot of us complain about with Anchor. So a service like Messy.fm, you're probably beyond that. Now, there might be a particular little tool that they can do that simplifies your life, and it might be worth using for that one particular tool, or there might be something else that can do that tool better for you. But I haven't actually tried the tool itself. So Mark, if you would at some point post in the forum, and we'll link to that, and we can continue that discussion there as well. So if anyone does try Anchor, wants to share their Messy.fm wants to share their results or their experience with that, then I'd love to hear that as well. Troy Price asked about podcast editing fee guidelines. He said, someone has approached me and asked how much I charge for podcast production editing. What are industry standards and rules of thumb to apply to this technical task? This can be really difficult. because now you're talking about the value you provide, which can be really difficult to measure. There are some general guidelines you can use. One of these is airmedia.org, has a freelance, they call it a podcasting rate guide for independent audio producers. They released this in July 2015. And in there, they talk about different levels as well as level of experience. So I'll describe this to you. They have for level 1 is involve research and enterprise reporting. This is very like journalistic style editing based. So this won't apply as much maybe, but they say involve research and enterprise reporting, require substantial subject matter expertise, have a sophisticated narrative written in scenes, require travel by the reporter, are sound rich with a variety of sounds, demonstrative or supportive of the story, may be funded through grants or other third-party sources. That just level 1 right there, that's probably none of the kind of people we work with, or almost none. But some of these also talk about like level 3 involves interviewing people, minimal sound effects. And for each of these levels, they also talk, they base it on what your experience is for this. So actually, I think I read this wrong. Yeah, their levels are actually the opposite of what I expected. So let's jump back to level 3. Level 3 pieces typically involve interviewees found through other reports and news conferences, contain interviews conducted mostly in one place or on the phone, and involve minimal sound and sound effects or special effects. So that's probably closer to what we'd work with. So then they say level of experience, novice, intermediate, advanced. So a level 3, novice, $375. Intermediate, $430. Advanced, $540. Is that per episode? Is that per month? I don't know. They don't really explain this on their sheet. So as a rate guide for independent audio producers, I don't know that it's really worth anything to look at this other than just that's a number. Okay. They talk about day sync and day rates, or tape sync and day rates, pilot production, original ideas, rendering ideas, and commissioning organization. This is completely worthless. What I recommend instead, 2 different things. One is get the book, The Business of Podcasting. I had the chance to look at this before it was published and read the whole thing, and it's pretty good. Now, does it actually recommend specific dollar amounts? I don't think so, but it did help you think through it a little bit. The big things to consider is the level of editing required. Like, are you simply removing certain sections that they indicate to you, like with time codes or markers that they place in the recording to say, okay, just whenever I mark this or whenever I clap or there's this long pause, then just remove the sentence before then, just clean up those sections. Is it more advanced editing, like putting together some kind of narrative or journalistic storytelling kind of thing where you're editing together a bunch of clips and going back and forth? Is it simply cleaning up the audio, maybe adding audio branding? Are you having to go through and listen and remove as many ums and uhs? Do you need to try and edit the content so that if it seemed like the conversation veered off topic, you edit that out? And how good is the quality of the recording they're able to give you? Are they expecting you to perform magic on it? So think about the amount of work there is to do. Think about, in a way, what it's worth to them, but it's not always the best place to start. Really look at the time you're saving them, the enhanced quality you're giving them. And one way that you could start calculating this and then start to come up with formulas, and I'll talk about some kind of formulas in a moment. But while it's not good to just trade hours for dollars and charge an hourly rate, an hourly rate is a good starting point to figure out other rates that you could charge. So I suggest pick an hourly rate of, maybe if you're just starting out, $25 an hour, or maybe $35 an hour. Somewhere in that range, I think is reasonable for starting out, depending on your skill level, your experience. Now, when you're just working on time-based work, that's where the complexity of the audio doesn't necessarily matter, because if it's really complex, it's going to take you more time and therefore cost more money. But it could be a way that you start to figure things out on your own. And especially as you've edited your own podcasts, track how long it takes you to edit the kinds of problems that you run into. If your podcast recordings are very clean, your own podcast recordings are very clean, that is, maybe it takes you only about 25% longer than the podcast is yourself to edit. Maybe it even takes you less time than the length of the podcast is because of how you edit and the quality of your recording. Use these things as a kind of basis so you can start to learn, okay, if the episode is an hour long, it takes me an hour and a half to edit at this particular level. And what am I doing in that hour and a half? Well, I'm just editing out the spots that really stood out. I'm processing the audio, doing some normalization, getting the volume levels right. I'm adding the intro and outro music, correcting a couple of silences, a couple mess ups here and there. So it's a fairly quick editing job, an hour and a half. Okay, that's one particular level. Another level might be, okay, I'm listening to the entire episode. I'm trying to remove every single and ah, reduce awkward pauses. I'm listening to the content, and if they didn't really answer the question or if the conversation got off track, I edit that out. And a 1 hour long podcast is taking me 3 hours to edit, and the episode ends up being only about 35 minutes after an hour of recording time. The final content is 35 minutes. So there's been a lot of editing there. Maybe that even took 4 hours to edit down. So, okay, that's 4 hours of work for that particular, quote, level, unquote, of editing. So if you're at, let's use an easy number, $25 an hour, then that second level that I mentioned might be $100 for a 1 hour podcast. If it's the lower level of editing, it might be $45 or $50 for a 1 hour podcast. If it's super high editing, like doing journalistic storytelling, adding sound effects, music, multiple audio tracks, extensive editing kind of thing, and it takes you hours and hours and hours to edit 1 hour, then that also gives you an idea of, okay, 1 hour of this podcast cost $800 or $400 or something like that. So what you're using is your hourly rate as a basis to start, and then you can start seeing this is typically what it costs to edit this amount of audio. Then you can start breaking that into tiers of editing. Like John Buchanan has done this, where episodes that are up to a certain length cost this much. If it's 5 minutes or if it's 26 minutes, it costs the same flat rate. Episodes that are so many minutes to some other level, like maybe it's 49 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes, cost this much. And if it's up and up like that. So you're coming up with some flat rates. And those flat rates are based on what it typically costs you in time to edit that same kind of episode times whatever your hourly rate is. Here's the other thing. Don't undersell yourself. If you come up with a number, you might want to consider just adding 25% to that, especially if it's a flat rate number, because you might not know what kinds of situations you could get yourself into. Like even for my own podcast that I've done, there have been episodes that were super easy for John Buchanan, my editor, to edit. And there were other episodes that were super hard for him to edit. And I ended up paying the same amount. The less editing necessary episodes kind of help cover for the more editing necessary episodes. But you might want to deal with that a little bit differently and consider the things of the amount of editing. Like this is how Pro Podcast Solutions, Daryl Darnell, does it, is that they do based on how much or different tiers of editing. And like if it's basic editing, if it's advanced editing and that kind of thing, if you're doing other things beyond the editing, like are you writing the show notes? Are you publishing to their website for them? Are you designing images for them? Are you making audiograms? Are you uploading it to their media host? Are you doing the ID3 tags for them? Are you writing tweets for them? Are you pulling out quotation marks? Are you making extra like blooper audio clips as well that they can share on their Patreon? Stuff like that. So these can also be value add-ons as well. And when you give a price to someone and they say, oh, that's too high, instead of backing down from the price, back down from the service. So you could say, well, okay, if $200 per episode is too high, then how about we simplify how much editing is done? Instead of I listen through and remove every single and that I find, how about instead I only remove the really distracting things and we can drop that price down instead. So you're still standing by your price and the value that you offer, but you're helping them to think more about the kind of results or the kind of results they expect from you, as well as the quality that they're giving you. So those are some ideas on how to price. And I think that maybe starting out, $25, $35 an hour, probably a reasonable rate for you. And then as you get more experience, you can start raising that price more. Or if the complexity of the project increases, then of course, definitely raise that price. And I think the goal would be for your clients to see a price based on their episode length and their level of editing. Because how many hours it takes you to edit it, they really don't care. They just care they care about their episode itself. Now, there could be something where you say that to edit it down by beyond a certain percentage or a certain ratio costs extra. Like if they give you 3 hours of audio and tell you to edit it down to a 15-minute episode, that's going to need to cost a lot more than straight out editing 3 hours or straight out editing 15 minutes. So some ideas there, some guidelines that you can use. Mark said, my last Resourceful Designer episode was about, Mark, what episode number was that? So we can look for that. He said, my last Resourceful Designer episode was about downselling, like you just talked about. Don't lower prices, lower the services you offer to win over clients. And Brian Insmooner said, there was a recent thread about pricing strategies in the Podcast Editors Club on Facebook. It's a closed group, so I can't share a link to the thread. Now, talking more about podcast editing as a business, Chris Curran will be hosting our next webinar talking about podcast production. And since he runs the Podcast Engineering School, where he specializes in helping you become a podcast engineer for hire, he'll probably provide a much better answer than I did. And that episode that Mark mentioned of Resourceful Designer was episode 130 at resourcefuldesigner.com/episode 130. Downselling to Win Design Clients was the name of that episode if you want to check that out. Now, as you get better at editing as well, and maybe start to fill up your schedule more, there are other things to consider, like maybe raising your prices on existing clients. A classic thing that I've heard before, because I have a freelance design background, is that when your workload gets too big, raise your prices. Yes, you lose clients, but you make more money and your workload is decreased. If you raise your price too high, then you'll lose all your clients. So you don't want to do that, like an overnight doubling of prices. But you can inch up your prices, and that's happened to me, and I'm okay with that because I know that sometimes the skill of someone increases as well as their availability decreases, and so you kind of grow with that, and you might even let your clients know that, or maybe you tell them you lock in at this particular rate as long as you pay this amount per month. And that could be something else is maybe you look at a flat monthly rate, say, I'll edit this many episodes per month, as long as they're no longer than an hour per episode, and it's this flat monthly rate. And you pay this rate regardless of how many episodes you release in that month, something like that. Always work on contracts with that kind of thing so people know what to expect. All right, jumping back to the chat room. Todd Uterstadt from Founder to CEO podcast said, my question is it worth looking at the new Apple Podcast download data? I've not seen mine yet. Was not sure if it is accurate and worth my time checking. Generally, I trust my Libsyn stats the most. Your thoughts? I think it is. It's really beneficial to look at the Apple Podcast analytics because they tell you a different story. Well, not a different story. They tell you more details about the current story. Your Libsyn stats or Blueberry or Spreaker or whoever you use for your download stats will give you a much better picture of your overall audience. The only exclusions to that are services that host your media for you, or quote, for you. Other distribution channels. Like, for example, if you have submitted your podcast to Spotify, your Spotify stats are separate from your normal download stats. Now, as Spotify works through things, at some point they will send that information back. It used to be that Stitcher was a separate stat from your regular download stats. Now it's not that case anymore. Stitcher downloads every episode directly from your podcast feed. So you don't have to look at separate stats, although Stitcher does give you more information specifically on their platform. So your download stats include essentially everything except Spotify, Google Play Music podcasts, which is kind of dead. Certain other distribution channels you may use, like SoundCloud, YouTube. If you cross-post to something else, like I cross-post to Spreaker and Audio Boom through some old APIs that they set me up with through some partnership thing, those downloads on those separate platforms don't contribute to my main downloads. But the main point is that those download stats, your main download stats, Libsyn, Blueberry, Spreaker, whatever, those are the most overall downloads. That's telling you this episode was downloaded this many times. What counts as a download is what this whole IAB, the Internet Advertising Bureau, I think is what Interactive Advertising Bureau, I think that's what it stands for. They have this IAB measurement guideline that podcast analytics companies are trying to implement and follow to basically say what really defines a download. If you have a 3-hour-long episode and only 30 seconds are downloaded, does that really count as a download or not? That's the kind of thing that they're working to define. Just like on YouTube, if you see a video has 20,000 views, that may seem impressive, but all it takes to count as a view is, I think it's 15 or 30 seconds, something like that. So if someone jumps out after 30 seconds, they're still counted as a view. That's where audience retention analytics in YouTube are really important. So you can see actually how many people actually stuck around beyond 90 seconds or a minute or something like that. So your download numbers, as long as there's a trend that's staying consistent or especially growing, you know that your audience is generally sticking around, because most podcast apps, or well, in particular the Apple Podcast app, if you don't listen to an episode or delete an episode or in some way engage with a podcast for a certain number of episodes, which I think is 5, it pauses the subscription. So it stops downloading new episodes. If you had 1,000 people subscribe to your podcast and not listen to any of your latest 5 episodes, not delete them, not play them or anything like that, then your download numbers from Apple Podcasts would significantly drop because their subscriptions would be paused automatically, but then resume once they engage with an episode again, or they can manually tap to say, yes, still keep downloading new episodes. So your download numbers do still let you see your audience size in general and downloads per episode specifically. But what about the Apple Podcast Analytics? What need is that filling? Well, it's very similar to Stitcher stats from back in the day, and Stitcher still provides this kind of information. But Stitcher was a very, very small piece of our download pie, whereas Apple Podcasts is a very big piece. On average, Libsyn and Spreaker have both, or Libsyn and Blueberry have both reported that they see the Apple ecosystem, or the Apple-owned podcast apps. That's iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and HomePod. Eventually Apple Watch as well, and maybe some other products they might release in the future. But their own apps account for, on average, around 60% of all of your downloads. You can look at your own podcast analytics to see more information about that. But generally, you could just assume that 60% of the people who listen to your podcast are probably listening through one of Apple's own apps. Apple Podcasts is the biggest one on iOS. iTunes is now like, I think, 5%, 15% of that 60%, maybe, however that works out. But it's a very, very small percentage. Apple Podcasts is the app that's on iOS. iTunes is the app that's on Windows and Mac computers. I have a theory, and I posted about this in the forums, that iTunes as a podcast app will completely go away within the next year or so. That I think Apple Podcasts as an app will be brought to the desktop because of what I see Apple doing with bringing iOS apps to desktop in some of the future versions of macOS. But anyway, so the Apple Analytics give you more information about that very large chunk, the 60% or so. And even in that, it's a slightly smaller chunk because it's only tracking the latest versions, iTunes 12.7 or newer, as well as iOS 10, 11 or newer. What version are we on now? 11. Yeah, iOS 11 or newer. Now, the stats they provide, now that you know it's maybe 50% of your audience, truly, that they're representing. I know I've thrown out a lot of numbers. So let's back that up, simplify it, and say, what you see in your Apple Analytics is probably representing about half of your audience. There, all of that information to say that. What can you learn from that? Don't look at the download numbers, because you can get those download numbers from other places. Look instead at how the episodes are downloaded. What Apple Podcast Analytics will show you, and you can even look at a graph. I'd share my screen with you, but I just don't have it set up at the moment. But what the analytics can show you is a timeline, very similar to if you look at audience retention stats inside of YouTube, a timeline that you can see how many people are listening at certain points inside your audio. So you can see that 5 minutes in, 90% of your audience was there. And you can see that at 10 minutes, there's this big dip. And I've heard some people call it the ice cream scoop, where you see this dip and then they jump back in. And what happened in that dip? Well, usually that's where there's an ad or some kind of segment that a lot of people want to skip. So the podcast analytics that Apple is providing, representing about maybe only 50% of your audience or 45% of your audience, shows you more detail about how they're consuming your podcast, whether they're streaming it where they press play without downloading the full thing first, or they did download it first and they're pressing play, as long as they're using one of those newer Apple-made podcast apps, not simply a podcast app on an Apple device. It has to be one of Apple's own podcast apps. So you can learn really, really cool things from that. Just that graph alone to show you the consumption analytics can be really informative, because then you can see how long people are listening or where they're skipping out in your podcast. If you see a big dip right where your advertising spots are, then you know people are skipping the ads. And that's not necessarily something you have to tell an advertiser if you have one, but it's something you can be aware of and learn from. That's really the reason we get analytics, is to learn from them and make decisions based on those analytics to improve things. So what can you learn if you see a dip? You can learn that maybe the way that you are doing that ad spot is not as engaging. If you do an ad spot and you see almost no dip, I think you'll see a dip almost regardless of how good you are at an ad spot. But if you see almost no dip when you do an ad spot, it's probably showing that your audience really likes how you do that ad. You could also assume other things, though. Or I don't mean assume, but there could be other situations where maybe it's just the nature of your audience is that most of them don't have a way to skip the ads. They've got their hands busy or something like that. So it's not a universal assumption we can make. But in general, if you see a dip, they're skipping it for some reason. You can also see certain things like when are they jumping out of the episode. So if near the end of your episode, you start thanking all your supporters, you thank your mom, you give all the calls to action, you do all these other things near the end, announcements and such, you're going to see people jump out near the end. And you can learn things from this. So you can learn that, okay, if I announce something at this point in my podcast, then I've probably only got this percentage of people listening. But if I instead mention it at this point in my podcast, then I have this much bigger percentage listening. That doesn't mean you need to move that stuff. Please don't put your announcements all up front at the beginning of your podcast and all your calls to action, because then you're going to see people skipping that too. But this can let you know better how many people are hearing that spot. So instead of getting discouraged that, oh man, only 10 people took action when I gave this call to action, you might look at your stats and see that, oh, only 15 people were listening when I said that. So 10 people out of 15 people is really good. It's not as bad as I thought it was. Then you look at other ways to improve your podcast. Looking at my own stats, comparing like the Audacity to podcast to Once Podcast being a podcast about a TV show, the Audacity to podcast being an educational podcast about how to podcast. So we've got educational and entertaining. What I found was really interesting. The entertaining podcasts had, on average, a 100%, sometimes even a greater than 100% completion rate, that people were listening all the way through. The educational podcast, people were listening mostly through. The average completion rate was closer to 85%. You might think, oh, maybe that's episode length. The educational podcast, average 30 to 40 minutes per episode. The entertaining podcast, average 2 to 3 hours per episode. It had nothing to do with the length. My theory is it's really about promises. What is the promise that you're kind of making to your audience with your content? What expectations do they have coming to your content? And as long as you are fulfilling that promise, as long as you are giving them the information you're giving them what they came for, they're going to stay. But when you stop giving them what they came for, they leave. Think about Marvel movies. Iron Man, Avengers, any of those. Marvel made it cool to stay through the credits. And I'm one of those people who stays through the credits anyway. But why do people leave when the credits come up? Because they didn't come just to hear music and see a bunch of names scrolling past. They came to be entertained. But if you make those credits entertaining, people will stay. Or like with Marvel, now everyone assumes that Nick Fury is going to come recruit someone to the Avengers, or I guess we're past that phase now. But it's a long joke that I've had with the end of movies, as I always expected Nick Fury to come and recruit someone for the Avengers. But people often stay for that last scene because they know there's still entertainment yet to be gotten from this. So I'm just going to stay through the credits, talk about the movie a little bit while the credits are playing, and maybe the cool music, which I really like soundtrack music. That's one of the reasons I stay. So they might then lost the train of thought. Here it is. They stay for value they expect. What was happening in my episodes? In the Audacity to Podcast, an educational podcast, near the end was when it stopped being educational. That's when I'd read a couple iTunes reviews, thank some people for those reviews, give some shout outs, share some announcements, it stopped providing the value that people were expecting, and that is to be educated or inspired in some way about podcasting. That's why people would start leaving at that point, about 15% of the audience. Our Once Upon a Time podcast, entertainment-based podcast, was entertaining all the way to the end. Even when we would do our sponsorship things and other announcements, we would do them in an entertaining way, so people would stay for those things. It had nothing to do with the length. This is the kind of stuff that you can learn from your Apple Podcast stats. And the place that you would get that from now, I've heard that there's some issues right now, either logging in or submitting a new podcast, or maybe the analytics aren't updating. But the place that you would go to get this information would be podcasts, with an S in the middle, podcastsconnect.com. Log in with the Apple ID you used when you submitted your podcast, and that's where your analytics are there, and you can learn a lot of information from that. That doesn't mean you have to change things based on what you see, but it can at least inform you and inspire you to try some new things. Don't assume it means, oh, we need to cut this out, or we need to make our episodes longer or shorter. Think instead, how can you improve what's already there? If it's something that you need to improve. Maybe it is something you need to cut out. You see that no one's really sticking around for the announcements, so maybe you cut out the announcements. Or maybe you move the announcements to somewhere in the middle of your podcast, and maybe you make your announcements shorter. Instead of 5 minutes of announcements, you give a 15-second thing, a 15-second announcement with a call to action or a reminder or something like that. Or you remind them in other contexts like an email list or Twitter or Facebook or something like that. And you can also see other really cool things from that. And I've done a webinar before inside of the Podcaster Society webinars where I actually walked through different things and showed you some screenshots of some of the different analytics that they give. So you can see, although I believe I did that. Maybe I didn't. Actually, I'm remembering things incorrectly because, no, I haven't done that webinar. So that could be a webinar that I'll do at some point, is walking you through some of those analytics, or a course or a lesson or something, so you can see some of the information and start to learn some of your own things. So you can find that at podcastsconnect.com, and you could share some of your own insights from that as well. So it looks like that is, or was, all of the questions that came in for this particular webinar. We'll be doing more of these webinars, probably for now, 2 webinars per month, but we might have more. And again, keep posting your questions to the forums, because that makes it a lot easier for us to link to them and keep the conversations going years from now, and makes it a lot easier for you as well as the others. And we'd love to help you make your podcast amazing. That's what we're all here for in Podcaster Society. If you're wondering about your podcast inside of Google Podcasts, I'll have some more resources about that soon, but there is that tool that you might have seen. I've sent it out in the email as well as in the Slack group. It's now on its own website. It's not public yet, so please don't announce it, but it doesn't require a login or anything. I just haven't publicly announced it, but you can use it, play with it. It's in beta right now. Whatismypodcastfeed.com. There are other forms of that URL that I also registered that forward over, but that's the main one, is whatismypodcastfeed.com. Allows you to search for your podcast and see what RSS feed that they have. Oh, thank you, Joe, for reminding me about the other question that he had sent. I just didn't have it in front of me. But whatismypodcastfeed.com. So when you search for your podcast, it'll show you what iTunes listings there are for that search, as well as what Google Podcast listings. And what would be important for you to see with that is what RSS feed is Google Podcast using, and maybe discover if there are other versions of your podcast existing in Google Podcasts that were automatically indexed that you didn't want to be indexed. Like a couple weeks ago, it was Castbox stuff. Maybe it's Audio Boom or Spreaker or other websites or things like that. And also you can use that tool to find your RSS feed. So it's easy for you to quickly validate it, because I built in links to that. So when you find your podcast listing, you just click a link and it jumps you over to Cast Feed Validator or Podbase to validate your feed. And there will be some other really cool features coming in the future for that. So Joe Lample's question was, he sent me an audio sample I'm not able to play for you, but his basic question was how to remove reverb from a recording. So there's all that stuff we talk about the importance of get a good, clean recording when you first start. That's what's most important. But if you've already recorded, that doesn't help you because you can't go back in the past and correct the recording. You have what you have. Now it's time to clean it up. If at all possible, because the audio sample Joe sent me was an MP3 file and it already had things mixed together, if at all possible, edit things on separate tracks. If they were recorded that way. So you have your voice in one track and someone else's voice in another track. That way you can process only the track that has the reverb on it. If that's not possible, it's okay. It just might reduce the overall quality a little bit for even your voice. But just something to keep in mind is try to silo those things or sandbox them in some way. So you're only editing what needs to be edited or processed or cleaned up, only what needs to be cleaned up. Before I share some thoughts on fixing that, you have to ask the question, does it really need to be edited? The most important person to sound good in your podcast is you. The reason for that is if you watch the TV show Lost, there's this point where they're talking about a constant. And this one guy says, if something bad happens, Desmond is my constant. And you are your audience's constant because you're the person they hear episode after episode after episode after episode. If you have an interview podcast, or you have guests join you on your podcast, the voices are already changing for those people each time. Your voice isn't. You are the constant. So it's most important for your voice to be the best sounding. And that's easy for you to do because you are in control of your own voice, your own environment, your own equipment that you're using. You might not be in control of what your guests are working with. And it's good to try and get the best results possible. But as long as they can be heard and understood, then it might be okay. Look at radio and you'll see that they use phone calls often for their guests. And they might have a guest expert on talking for hours on a radio show. And they're just talking through the phone, really low quality, but the main radio host is really high quality. And you can still hear and understand them. Maybe not as clearly as the radio host, but still you get the content. So that's the first thing that it does beg the question, does it really need to be cleaned up in that way? Now, Chris Curran will talk more about reducing reverb and probably show some specifics and let you hear some specifics. But if you do have reverb and you've decided that, yes, you do need to clean it up, it's, I'm not going to say so bad that you have to clean it up because then you might just need to re-record it. But anyway, if you really want to try and clean it up, most editing tools don't really already have good deverb tools built in, and that's what you typically look for is deverb or reverb removal, but usually they're called deverb. Reverb, by the way, is not completely an echo. Like if you go to the Grand Canyon and you shout out something and you say, "Hey, stupid," and then you hear back, "Hey, stupid, hey, stupid, hey, stupid, hey, stupid." That's an echo where you hear it clearly separated from the source sound. Or like if you're in an auditorium and you clap and you hear the clap come back to you a second later or so, that's an echo. Reverb is when the echo is so close in timing that you don't hear a distinct repeat, but you do still hear it back slightly delayed. And that's what the reverb is. It's the audio signal bouncing off reflective surfaces coming back at a slight delay. So think about like if you're in a stairway or you're in a bathroom or you're in an empty house with no furniture and you clap or you snap your fingers, sometimes it sounds robotic to you. That's the slight delay, the phasing a little bit with the reverb. Its sound bounces off nearby surfaces, comes back to you. So it gives this sound that someone is in an auditorium or a bathroom or an empty room, stuff like that. And it can be distracting. It can reduce the understandability of the audio if it's really bad. And the audio sample that Joe gave me was not actually that bad. I could listen to it and understand what was being said. It really wasn't horrible. So it didn't really need to be cleaned up. It sounded, I could tell that they weren't in an ideal situation, but it sounded a lot better than I actually expected before I played it. But what can you do to reduce the reverb? So a couple things that you can try. One is sometimes noise removal tools can do a pretty good job of reducing the reverb as well. And typically the way that noise removal tools work is you select a portion of the noise as a noise footprint or a fingerprint or a profile of some sort. And then it looks for that kind of profile across all of the audio, and you can reduce that by certain volumes or certain amounts, and you can expand the frequencies and such. That's how a noise removal thing typically works. What you would want to try and look for would be, if you could select as a sample for that noise profile, is look for a spot where it has the room noise, which might be the fan, just the general environment of the room. So if you were both being completely silent or your guest was being completely silent, what noise is still coming through anyway? That's your room noise. The reverb would be, what are you hearing in addition to their voice when you're speaking? What other forms of their voice? So look for, maybe you could grab a little sample for the noise profile of, they are not speaking, but you still capture just a little bit of that reverb, and then some of the room tone, the room noise, background hiss, fans, anything like that. You use that as your noise profile, and then run your noise removal or noise reduction. You can never completely remove the noise. You're just reducing it. You run that and then listen to how it sounds. There's sometimes this trade-off where if you remove the noise too much, you'll start to sound like you're underwater. And that's too much. You want to try and maintain the integrity and the clarity of the audio. And sometimes that might mean leaving some of that noise or reverb in. So sometimes a noise removal or noise reduction tool can do the job for you. Sometimes it might be a frequency, like a equalizer, graphic equalizer, a parametric equalizer, or something like that. And the way that would work would be that you just have to experiment with playing with different frequencies. And I suggest like completely blowing it out all the way up or all the way down. And you're looking for what particular frequencies can you reduce in order to reduce the sound of that reverb. Because the way that acoustics work is that reverb will, depending on the room, might be in only certain frequencies or stronger in certain frequencies than others. Lower frequencies travel much better through surfaces than high frequencies do. That's why you often hear the beat from music coming through a car, but you don't really hear the lyrics coming through the car because the beat, the low frequencies, are passing through objects better than the higher frequencies the vocal ranges are. Some rooms reflect the higher frequencies much more than the lower frequencies. Some rooms or positioning reflect the lower frequencies more. So you can play with that a little bit in an equalizer, that you see, okay, what does reducing, I'm just throwing out a number here, what does reducing 300 hertz, what does dropping that down 100%, what does that do? What about 320 hertz or 330 hertz? Parametric EQ allows you to drag things around, and Joe is using Adobe Audition, so there's a really good parametric equalizer in there, which is an equalizer. But instead of individual frequencies you're adjusting, you can adjust points along a line and drag them around, and they kind of automatically smooth out. So you can drag that back and forth to find particular frequencies and maybe multiple frequencies that you can reduce. And it doesn't compromise the integrity of your source sound, but it reduces some of those reverb frequencies. You might not be able to completely clean up the reverb, but you can reduce it a little bit or make it a little less distracting, maybe, depending on those frequencies. And it takes experimentation because a lot of things are very different. But really, probably the best way to reduce the reverb after it's already been recorded and you can't re-record or fix the original recording or fix the original situation, you need a deverb plugin, a reverb reducing plugin. Many of these tools don't really have a good one built in. You might be able to find some free ones on the internet, like a VST plugin usually works for Audacity as well as Audition. Audio Units, AU plugins are plugins that work only on Mac OS. You might also find other like AAX, which I think is only for Logic. But most audio processing plugins are VST or have some of these other additional options. Like there's this one I'm playing with right now, just installed today. Acusonics reached out to me and said, hey, we'd love for you to review our plugins. Here's a license that you can try our plugins for free, and we'll even set you up with the affiliate program if you like it, if you want to recommend it. So I said, okay, I'll check it out. Actually, I think I asked about the affiliate program if they had one, just in case I decide to recommend it. But Acusonics, ACCUSO, I don't remember how to spell it, but it's one particular plugin. And what appeals to me about it is it's very simple. I like simple for us as podcasters because then we don't have to learn as much about how things work. We can just turn a single knob. And their plugins are pretty simple, and they can work with Audacity, with Adobe Audition, with Logic. If your audio editing software can accept plugins, then these plugins probably would work for it because they're available as VST, Audio Units, AAX, and such. The price for this suite of plugins that they have is, I think, $129, and you get like a de-esser, you get a reverb reduction tool, a noise reduction tool. These kinds of tools are designed for reducing reverb, and expect to pay somewhere around $50 to $100 for a good one. That might be worth it to you. Or you could talk to an audio editor who maybe specializes in this kind of thing, and you say, I don't need you to edit this. All I need you to do is reduce the reverb. And they might say, oh yeah, sure, I'll do that for free. Or maybe they'll say, yeah, no problem, just $10 and I'll run it through my processor. It takes them 20 seconds or so maybe. And then they spit it back and send it back to you. But a reverb reduction plugin is really the best way to go. And you might have to buy one. But you could get some results, decent results, using noise reduction. I've even seen Aphonic sometimes do a pretty good job at reducing the reverb. Not all the time, but sometimes it's done a good job. It could be playing with the equalizer settings. But Chris Curran will be doing a podcast production coaching session in a couple weeks, and we'll announce the dates for that later through email as well as in Slack chat. And he'll be able to explain it and much more, show you a plugin and let you hear some of the different results. But really, I think it goes back to, and specifically for you, Joe, the audio sample that you gave me sounded good enough. And I would say if you didn't have the time or the resources to really dig into editing it, I would say it's good enough to publish as it is. I could hear the person clearly and understand them. And I think as long as it reaches that threshold, it's probably okay. We can always clean things up more, sure. All right. That's it for this general podcasting Q&A. If you have other questions, post in the forums or in Slack, and we might pull some of those questions for future webinars to dig into more with myself or one of the other experts. And if there are specific themes you want us to cover as well, please share those with us and we can talk about that. I know that growing your audience and monetization tend to be the most common themes, and so we'll definitely be touching on those, as well as some other things like legal issues, production issues, and much more. Thank you for being part of Podcaster Society. I'm looking forward to getting back into the flow of things and hope that you are too. And keep growing your podcast and making it amazing. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. Thanks for joining me.